Listen here, child. Gather close to this old fire that burns low but never dies. I's elder Moses bent like the gnarled cypress roots that grip the Georgia clay, and tonight I carry a memory that weighs heavier than iron chains. This ain't no tale for the faint of heart, no sir. This here is blood memory, the kind that runs deep in the veins of our people, passed down from the ones who crossed that terrible water in the belly of slave ships. Down in the quarters when the moon hides its face and only the ancestors watch, we speak of a woman named Harriet. They say she came from the shores of Senegal with the old magic still burning in her bones, with eyes that could see into tomorrow and roots that could heal or curse. But the white folks, Lord have mercy, they feared what they couldn't break, and fear makes monsters of men. Tonight I's gonna tell you about the night they took her eyes with a rusty nail, and how her curse followed the mistress into madness and the grave. This memory lives in the wind that still whispers through them cotton fields, in the red clay that drank so much of our blood, in the spirituals we sing when sorrow gets too heavy to carry alone. Hush now and let the ancestors speak through me, for what you about to hear ain't written in no white man's book, but it's carved in the soul of every child born from suffering. This is Harriet's story, and ours. The fire crackles, the night grows still, and the telling begins. In them days of deep sorrow, when the great water swallowed our people whole and spit them out in chains, Harriet knew only darkness. The belly of that slave ship was hell itself, child. A wooden coffin floating on waves that cared nothing for the cries of the dying. She was but 15 summers when they took her, ripped her from the red earth of Senegal, where the baobab trees stood like ancient sentries, and the rivers sang songs her grandmother taught her. Now, listen here. The middle passage ain't something you can truly speak on unless you felt it in your bones. Harriet lay chained in that suffocating hold, bodies pressed so tight she couldn't tell where her flesh ended, and another's began. The stench, Lord of glory, the stench of death, of waste, of suffering so thick it coated your tongue like ash. Folks died all around her, just gave up their spirits right there in the dark, and their bodies stayed chained to the living till the white sailors came to drag them away. Harriet, though, she was strong-backed and fierce. Her grandmother been a root doctor back home, one who communed with the Orishas, and could call down storms when the village needed rain. That old woman had placed her wrinkled hands on Harriet's head before the raiders came, whispered words in the old tongue, breathed ancestral power into the girl's soul. "You carry us with you," she'd said. "They can chain your body, but your spirit flies free." So Harriet survived when so many didn't. She kept her eyes closed in that darkness, not from fear but from vision. She saw things, child. Things that weren't there in the flesh but were real as the iron around her wrists. She saw her village burning, saw her mother's face twisted in anguish, saw the path ahead lit by a strange light that promised nothing but pain. The ancestors whispered to her in dreams that weren't quite dreams. "Hold on. Your suffering has purpose. The chains will teach you their secrets." Days bled into weeks, weeks into forever. The ship rocked and moaned like a dying beast. Sometimes folks went clean out of their minds from the horror of it all, screaming and wailing till the overseers came down with whips and clubs. Harriet learned fast to keep quiet, to swallow her rage and fear, to let it settle deep in her belly where it could ferment into something harder than hate, something cold and patient, like the snake waiting in tall grass. When they finally brought them up on deck, mercy me, the sun was like fire after all that darkness. Harriet blinked against the light, her eyes burning, her legs barely holding her weight. The sailors threw buckets of salt water on them, scrubbed them down rough like they was livestock, and the strong ones they kept, the weak ones they threw overboard without a second thought. Harriet saw bodies hit the water, heard the splash, watched the ocean swallow them whole. Her heart went heavy then, heavy as iron, knowing that the great water had become a graveyard, that it held more African bones than all the earth back home. The ship pulled into Charleston Harbor on a gray morning, when the fog hung low over the water like spirits returning home. Harriet stood on deck, chains clinking, and saw for the first time this cursed land that would become her prison. The docks crawled with white men, their faces hard and cold, their eyes assessing flesh like farmers judging mules at market. She heard a language she didn't know, harsh and choppy, nothing like the musical tongue of her people. They marched them off the ship, stumbling and weak, and the auction block waited like a hungry mouth. Lord, the auction block. That platform of wood stained with the tears of thousands, where families got torn apart, where humanity got reduced to dollars and cents. Harriet was pushed forward with the others, made to stand while white folks walked around, poking at her arms, prying open her mouth to check her teeth, prodding her belly to see if she was breeding age. The auctioneer, a fat man with a voice like gravel, hollered out the bids. Strong back, good breeder, straight from Africa with plenty of work years left. Harriet stood tall despite her fear, her eyes burning with defiance that some of them white folks noticed and didn't like. A few muttered about her being too proud, needing to be broken proper, but the bidding went on. In the crowd, Harriet's eyes found another African face, a woman maybe 10 years older, also just off the ship, also standing on that damned block. Their eyes met, and in that moment they was kin, the last connection either had to the world they'd lost. The woman's name had been Amma back home, but that didn't matter no more in this new hell. When the gavel fell, Harriet was sold for $300 to a plantation owner named Jeremiah Sinclair from somewhere in Georgia. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the finality, the cold transaction that had just made her property. As they led her away in chains, she looked back one last time at Amma, still standing on the block, and their eyes held a promise. We remember. We survive. We never forget. But they pulled Harriet into a wagon with others bound for Sinclair's plantation, and as Charleston faded behind them, she lost sight of Amma forever. That was the way of slavery, child, ripping apart every connection, every thread of love or kinship, till you was alone in a world full of people. Harriet swore then, in her heart, that the ancestors would not let this stand, that somehow, someday, there would be reckoning. The wagon rolled south through red clay roads and endless forests, and Harriet's journey into bondage had truly begun. Folks swear on their lives that the Sinclair plantation in Georgia was one of the cruelest stretches of cursed land the Lord ever let exist. The cotton fields stretched far as the eye could see, white bowls bursting under that killing heat, row after endless row waiting to be picked by black hands. The big house sat on a rise like a white tomb overlooking the quarters, its columns gleaming in the sun, hiding the rot inside. Harriet arrived there in chains, along with 6 other souls fresh from the auction block. The overseer, a mean-spirited man named Hackett with eyes cold as creek stones in winter, looked them over with disgust. Fresh off the boat, he spat, tobacco juice straining his beard. Gonna have to break this one proper. He pointed his whip at Harriet, who stood tall despite her fear, her eyes meeting his without flinching. That first night in the quarters was when Harriet truly understood the deep hole she'd fallen into. The slave cabins was ramshackle things, logs chinked with mud, dirt floors that turned to muck when it rained, thin blankets that did nothing against the cold. She was shoved into a cabin already cramped with 5 other women, all field hands with backs scarred from the whipping post and hands calloused rough as tree bark. One woman, old and gray-headed, touched Harriet's shoulder gentle-like. "What they call you, child?" Harriet tried to speak her true name, the one her mother gave her under African stars, but it came out broken, foreign on her own tongue. The overseer had already told her she was Harriet now, nothing else, and that name carried the weight of bondage. "Harriet," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. The old woman nodded, her eyes full of knowing sorrow. "Eyes called Aunt Dinah. Been on this plantation 30 years, child. You listen to old Dinah, you might survive. Don't be fooled by pretty words or kind faces from the big house. Master Sinclair, he's a devil in gentleman's clothes, and that overseer Hackett, Lord have mercy, he shows no mercy for weakness." The next morning, before dawn even thought about breaking, a bell clanged harsh through the quarters. Harriet stumbled out with the others into the gray darkness, her body aching from the voyage, her spirit heavy-hearted. They lined up while Hackett walked up and down, whip in hand, assigning tasks. "You new gal," he barked at Harriet. "Cottonfield. You'll pick your weight or you'll meet the post." And so began Harriet's education in suffering. The cotton fields was endless, the rows stretching to where the earth met sky, and the sun climbed hot and merciless, turning your back into fire. She was given a sack and told to fill it, and when you ain't never picked cotton before, child, you don't know the special kind of torture it is. Them bowls cut your fingers raw, the rough leaves scraped your arms bloody, and you bent over all day till your spine felt like it would snap. But Harriet was strong-backed, just like the auctioneer promised. She learned the rhythm quick. Pluck, drop, move. Pluck, drop, move. Her hands dancing through the cotton while her mind drifted elsewhere. She sang under her breath, songs from home that the others didn't know, melodies that carried her across the ocean and back to where the spirits still walked free. The other slaves noticed her. There was Big Samuel, a man of iron with shoulders broad as an ox, who'd been born on the plantation and knew nothing but chains. There was young Elijah, barely 16, riled up with the kind of rage that got you killed if you wasn't careful. And there was Clara, a woman of steel about Harriet's age, who'd been sold away from her baby somewhere in Virginia and carried that pain like an open wound. During the brief rest at midday, when the sun was at its cruelest, and even Hackett retreated to the shade, the slaves huddled together, sharing water from a bucket and what little food they was given. Cornbread hard as rocks, fatback if they was lucky. Harriet sat with them, her body trembling from exhaustion, sweat pouring down her face. "Where you from, girl?" Clara asked, her voice soft with curiosity. Harriet tried to explain, but the words was all tangled. She pointed east, toward the ocean, and made gestures that told of trees and rivers and red earth. The others nodded, understanding without words what she'd lost. "We all lost something," Big Samuel said, his voice deep as a drum. "Some of us born here, some brought here. Don't matter much in the end, we all just surviving." But Harriet felt something stirring inside her, something the middle passage hadn't killed, something the auction block hadn't broken. The gift her grandmother gave her was waking up, stretching like a cat after sleep. She could feel the land beneath her feet, the old spirits trapped in this cursed soil, the ancestors calling to her from beyond the veil. That night back in the quarters, Aunt Dinah noticed Harriet's faraway look, the way her eyes seemed to see things that wasn't there in the flesh. "You got the sight, don't you, child?" she whispered, making sure none of the others heard. Harriet met her eyes and nodded slowly. In Africa, such gifts was honored, respected. Here, she sensed, they might get you called a witch or worse. But Aunt Dinah smiled, her old face creasing with something like hope. "There was another one with the sight years back," she murmured. "Old conjure woman named Mother Ruth. She knew roots and herbs, could heal or curse depending on what was needed. They sold her off south when Master Sinclair got scared of her power. But she taught me a little, enough to know the real thing when I see it." From then on, a quiet bond formed between Harriet and the others in the quarters. They saw her strength, her refusal to be broken by the daily grind of work and whippings. They saw how she never cried out when Hackett's whip caught her for moving too slow, how she stood straight even when her back was bloody. But it was Master Sinclair himself who became the shadow over Harriet's life. One day, maybe 3 months after she arrived, he came riding through the fields on his fine horse, surveying his property like a king inspecting his kingdom. His eyes landed on Harriet, bent over in the cotton rows, her dress soaked with sweat, her beauty evident even in bondage. Master Sinclair was a man in his 50s, thick around the middle, with a face that might have been handsome once, but was now marked by cruelty and excess. He reined in his horse and watched Harriet work, his gaze hungry in a way that made her skin crawl. "That the new gal from Charleston?" he asked Hackett, who'd come running at his master's approach. "Yes, sir, Master Sinclair. Strong worker, picks clean, ain't caused no trouble." "Pretty thing," Sinclair mused, his voice thick with implication. "Real pretty." And Harriet felt the weight of that gaze like chains settling on her shoulders. She kept her eyes down, kept picking, but her heart beat like African drums. loud, fast, full of warning. The ancestors whispered, "Danger comes from the big house. Prepare yourself." But it wasn't just the master she had to fear. Up on the veranda of the big house, partially hidden by white columns and blooming magnolias, stood the mistress, Miss Eliza Sinclair. She was watching too, her pale face twisted with something sharp and bitter. Jealousy, maybe, or hatred, or both mixed together into something poisonous. Miss Eliza saw everything: her husband's lingering gaze, the way his jaw tightened with want, the way this new slave girl stood tall and proud despite her bondage. And in that moment, a seed was planted. A seed of vengeance that would grow into something terrible. Something that would end in blood and madness and curses that echoed through generations. Harriet felt those eyes on her too, burning from the big house. And she knew without being told that her real trials hadn't even begun. The cotton fields was hard, yes, but the true danger lurked in the hearts of white folks who saw her not as human, but as property to be used, broken, destroyed if necessary. That night, as the slaves gathered quietly in the quarters, singing low spirituals that spoke of crossing over and seeing the promised land, Harriet closed her eyes and prayed to the ancestors. She asked for strength, for protection, for the power to survive whatever was coming. And somewhere in the spirit world, they heard her and began to gather their forces. The stage was set, the players was in place, and the tragedy that would become legend was about to unfold. Now listen here, child, 'cause this is where the story takes a turn toward the spirit world, where the ancestors make themselves known, and the old magic starts to wake up from its long sleep across the ocean. 6 months had passed since Harriet arrived at the Sinclair plantation. 6 months of back-breaking labor under that killing heat. 6 months of learning the cruel rhythms of bondage. But something was stirring in the quarters at night. Something that made even old Aunt Dinah whisper prayers of gratitude to the Orishas. It started small, the way powerful things often do. Young Elijah took sick one evening, his body burning with fever so hot you could feel the heat rolling off him in waves. The plantation had no real doctor for slaves. They either got better on their own or they died, simple as that. Overseer Hackett looked at the boy and said, "If he ain't up by morning, drag him to the woods. Can't have sickness spreading." But Harriet, she had other plans. That night, when the quarters grew quiet and the paddy rollers finished their rounds, she slipped out into the darkness. The old ones warned her about wandering after curfew, but the ancestors were guiding her feet, showing her the way. She moved like a shadow through the moonless night, her bare feet knowing the earth in ways that can't be taught, only remembered. She went to the edge of the woods where the plantation land met the wild places, where roots grew deep and herbs flourished in secret. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, teaching her again what she'd learned as a child. This leaf for fever, that bark for pain, these roots ground together for strength. Harriet's hands moved with purpose, gathering what she needed, whispering prayers in the old tongue that the Georgia soil had never heard before, but recognized all the same. Back in the quarters, she brewed a tea over coals so low they barely glowed, the smell sharp and green filling the cabin. Aunt Dinah watched with knowing eyes, her old heart understanding what was happening. "The gift came across the water with you," she whispered. "Lord of glory, child, you carry the ancestors in your bones." Harriet made Elijah drink it all, every bitter drop, while Clara held his head and Big Samuel kept watch at the door. The boy grimaced and coughed, but within an hour his fever broke, sweat pouring off him like a summer rain. By morning, when Hackett came checking, expecting to find a corpse, Elijah was sitting up, weak but alive. "What the hell?" Hackett muttered, suspicious but with no proof of anything amiss. He looked hard at Harriet, who kept her eyes down proper-like, but something in his gaze said he'd be watching her closer now. Word spread through the quarters faster than fire through dry cotton. Harriet had the gift, the old African magic, the power to heal what the white man's medicine couldn't touch. Folks started coming to her at night, in the hush harbor of darkness, bringing their ailments and their fears. There was old Moses with his twisted leg that pained him something terrible. Harriet made him a poultice that eased the ache enough for him to work without crying out. There was young Bessie who couldn't conceive after being sold away from her first child. Harriet brewed her a tea of roots and whispered prayers that called on the fertility spirits. There was Big Samuel himself, scarred so deep from whippings that his back was a map of suffering. Harriet's salves couldn't erase the marks, but they soothed the burning that kept him awake at night. But it wasn't just healing, child. No, sir. Harriet could see things. Visions that came to her in dreams or in the quiet moments when she let her mind drift while picking cotton. She saw the future unfolding like a dark road ahead, saw danger and death and suffering, but also glimpses of freedom far away, shining like the North Star. One night, she gathered the trusted ones in her cabin: Aunt Dinah, Clara, Big Samuel, Elijah. The air was thick with secrets and the smell of cornbread they'd saved from supper. Harriet's eyes had that faraway look, like she was seeing beyond the walls, beyond the plantation, into the realm where spirits walked. "Something bad comes from the big house," she said, her voice low and certain. "I seen it in dreams 3 nights running. A woman with rage in her heart, a man with lust in his eyes and blood. Lord, so much blood. The spirit showing me a path of thorns ahead." Clara gripped her hand tight. "What kind of bad, sister? Can we run? Can we hide?" Harriet shook her head slowly. "Ain't no running from what's coming. It's written in fate, bound to happen. But the ancestors, they preparing me. They teaching me things, not just healing, but conjure, root work, the old ways of protection and power." Aunt Dinah leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "You talking about hoodoo, child? Real conjure?" "I'm talking about justice," Harriet said, and her eyes burned with a fire that made them all shiver. "The kind that don't come from no white man's law or preacher's prayer, but from the earth itself, from the spirits of all who suffered here before us. I'm learning to call on them, to make mojo bags and gopher dust, to work roots that can protect or curse depending on what's needed." Big Samuel, practical as always, asked the question they was all thinking. "And if they catch you doing conjure? If Hackett or Master Sinclair find out, that's a killin' offense, girl. They'll make an example of you." Harriet met his eyes steady, no fear in her voice. "We all dying here anyway, brother. Just a matter of how fast and how much we suffer first. I'd rather die standing with the power of my ancestors in my hands than live another 50 years broken and helpless. The old ones didn't survive the Middle Passage just so we could forget who we are." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Outside, a dog howled in the distance, and somewhere a chain rattled as someone shifted in their sleep. The plantation slept, but the spirit world was wide awake and watching. From that night on, Harriet became something more than just another field hand. She was a root doctor, a conjure woman, a keeper of the old ways. Folks came to her for healing, yes, but also for protection spells, for love charms, for justice work against cruel overseers. She taught them to bury bottles with herbs and hair at crossroads, to wear mojo bags under their clothes, to pray to the ancestors in the quiet of their hearts. But Aunt Dinah's warning echoed true. "Be careful, child. The more powerful you become in the quarters, the more dangerous you become to the big house. And powerful slaves don't live long unless they mighty clever or mighty blessed." Harriet nodded, but in her heart she knew the truth. Her path was already set. The ancestors had chosen her for something terrible and necessary, and all she could do now was prepare for the storm she'd seen coming in her visions. The storm that would drown them all in blood and madness before it was through. Mercy me. This part of the story carries a weight that even now, all these years later, makes my old heart heavy as iron. But truth must be told, child, no matter how it cuts. This is where the sin of the masters shows itself bare, where the peculiar institution reveals its rottenest core. It was a night in late summer when the air hung thick and still, and the quarters was quiet save for the crickets singing their endless song. Harriet had been on the plantation near a year now, had made herself useful enough that Hackett left her mostly alone, her picking fast and clean, her behavior outwardly obedient even while rebellion burned quiet in her heart. Master Jeremiah Sinclair had been watching her all that time, his eyes following her movements in the fields, his gaze lingering when she was called up to the big house to help with washing or serving. The other slaves seen it and whispered warnings. "Man like that got one thing on his mind," Big Samuel muttered, "and ain't nothing we can do to stop what's coming." Clara, who knew this particular horror firsthand, pulled Harriet aside one evening. "When he calls for you, and he will call for you, sister, you got two choices. Fight and get killed or survive and hate yourself after. Ain't no good choices for us, never has been." But Harriet, she had the sight, remember? She'd already seen this moment in her visions, had watched it unfold like a terrible flower opening its petals to reveal poison at its heart. The ancestors whispered to her in dreams, "This violation comes, daughter, but from it will be born your power. Suffering can become a weapon if you let it temper you like iron in fire." The call came on a Saturday night. Overseer Hackett appeared at her cabin door, his face showing no emotion, just delivering orders like she was cargo being moved from one place to another. "Master wants you at the big house, now." Harriet rose, her heart beating wild, but her face calm as still water. Aunt Dinah gripped her hand once, quick and desperate, then let go. They both knew what was about to happen, knew there was no stopping it, knew this was the way of this cursed world they lived in. The big house loomed white and ghostly in the moonlight, its windows glowing yellow with lamplight. Harriet was led through the back door, through the kitchen where the house slaves wouldn't meet her eyes, up the back stairs to the master's private chambers. The door closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid falling. Master Sinclair stood there in his nightshirt, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face flushed from drink and darker appetites. "Come here, gal," he said, his voice thick and heavy. When Harriet didn't move fast enough, he grabbed her arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "I said, come here. You understand English, don't you?" What happened next, child, I won't detail out of respect for Harriet's memory, and for all the women, thousands, tens of thousands, who suffered this same violation. Just know that Master Sinclair took what he wanted, as masters always did, as the law gave him the right to do, as if Harriet was nothing but property to be used and discarded. She didn't scream, didn't beg, kept her eyes open and fixed on something beyond him, beyond the room, beyond this world. In her mind, she was calling on the ancestors, on Oya the warrior, on Yemaya the mother, on all the spirits who knew rage and pain. She was gathering their power into herself, letting the violation become fuel for something bigger, something that would one day burn this plantation to the ground. When it was done, Master Sinclair pushed her away like she was nothing, already losing interest. "Get back to the quarters," he muttered, pouring himself more whiskey. "And keep your mouth shut, you hear? Tell anyone and I'll have you whipped till you can't walk." Harriet walked back through the darkness, her body aching, her soul screaming silently. But when she reached her cabin, when Clara and Aunt Dinah rushed to hold her, to cry with her, she stopped them with a look so fierce it froze them in place. "Don't weep for me," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "This ain't the end. This is just the beginning. The ancestors told me this would come, and they told me what it means. A child will be born from this violation. A child that will be the spark that lights the fire of my vengeance." And so it was. The weeks passed, then months, and Harriet's belly began to swell with life she never asked for. The other slaves watched with sorrow and anger, knowing the baby would be born into slavery, would carry Master Sinclair's blood mixed with Harriet's, would be a living reminder of the plantation's deepest sin. But it was Miss Eliza Sinclair, up in her big house, who watched with rage that grew like poison in her heart. She knew, of course she knew, wives always knew, that her husband forced himself on the slave women. But seeing Harriet pregnant, seeing the proof of his betrayal growing larger every day, something snapped inside the mistress. She'd been jealous before, but now her jealousy transformed into something darker, something that festered and rotted till it consumed her thoughts day and night. She'd catch herself staring at Harriet in the fields, her pale hands gripping her teacup so hard it nearly cracked. She'd lie awake at night, listening to her husband snore beside her, and imagined terrible things, whips and brands and chains, ways to make that proud slave girl suffer. "That gal thinks she's something special," she hissed to her personal maid, a house slave named Ruth. "Walking around with her belly full like she's better than she is. African devilry, that's what it is. She done put some kind of spell on Jeremiah, made him forget his proper place." Ruth kept her eyes down, knowing that agreeing was dangerous, but staying silent was worse. "Yes'm, Miss Eliza. Whatever you say, ma'am." But Miss Eliza wasn't finished. "There are ways to handle uppity slaves," she continued, her voice dropping low and venomous. "My father, he had a troublesome buck once. Took care of him real permanent-like. Made an example, he did, so the others knew their place. The seed of violence was planted then, watered by jealousy and rage, fed by the poisonous system that let white women take out their humiliation and powerlessness on the very women their husbands violated. Miss Eliza began planning, thinking, imagining the moment when she'd bring Harriet low, when she'd break that proud spirit once and for all. Down in the quarters, Harriet felt the danger growing like a storm on the horizon. Her visions came more frequent now, showed her blood and fire and pain beyond imagining. But they also showed her something else. Power, real power. The kind that could curse generations, that could drive the guilty into madness, that could make the earth itself reject the blood of oppressors. She began preparing in earnest then, gathered special roots and herbs, made offerings at the crossroads at midnight, spoke with the ancestors in a language that predated the Middle Passage. She was building something, conjuring something, creating a weapon out of her own suffering that would strike back when the time came. "Something bad's coming from the big house," she'd told them months before. Now that prophecy was taking shape, and Harriet knew with terrible certainty that before this story was done, blood would flow like rivers, and the curse she was preparing would echo through the ages. "Listen here, child. 'Cause even in the deepest darkness, there's moments of light that break through. Moments when love finds a way to bloom even in soil soaked with tears and blood. This is one of them moments. Bitter and sweet all mixed together like medicine that heals and hurts at the same time. The baby came on a cold January night, when frost covered the ground like sugar, and the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls. Harriet labored through the hours of darkness, her body racked with pain but her spirit refusing to break. Aunt Dinah served as midwife, her experienced hands guiding the child into this harsh world, while Clara and 2 other women kept vigil, singing low spirituals that spoke of crossing over Jordan and seeing the promised land. "Push, daughter," Aunt Dinah urged, her voice gentle but firm. "Call on your mama across the water. Call on all the women who birthed in chains before you. You ain't alone, child. Never alone." And Harriet did push, crying out words in the old tongue, calling on Yemaya, the mother of waters, on all the ancestors who'd given birth in the belly of slave ships, in the fields under the burning sun, in cabins just like this one. She pushed until finally, as dawn was breaking gray over the Georgia pines, the baby slipped free with a wail that seemed to carry all the sorrow of the world in it. "It's a boy," Aunt Dinah announced, holding up the squirming, crying infant. "Lord of glory, Harriet, you got yourself a son." They cleaned him with water warmed over the fire, wrapped him in what little cloth they had, and placed him in Harriet's arms. She looked down at his tiny face, at his features that told the truth of his parentage. Skin lighter than hers, hair that would curl soft instead of tight, a nose and mouth that favored Master Sinclair more than she could bear to admit. The other women saw it too and exchanged glances heavy with meaning. This child was evidence of the Master's sin, walking testimony to the violation that had created him. In some ways, he'd never fully belong anywhere. Too white for the quarters, too black for the big house, caught forever in the terrible in-between. But as Harriet held him, felt his small heart beating against her chest, something fierce and protective rose up in her like a flood. "He ain't his father's sin," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "He's mine, he's ours. He's a child of the ancestors just like any other, and I'll love him till my last breath." She named him Samuel, after Big Samuel, who'd become like an uncle to her, who stood watch at the cabin door now to make sure no overseer came snooping around during her recovery. It was a free name, a name carried by prophets and kings in the old scriptures, a name that spoke of being heard by God. For 3 days, Harriet was allowed to rest. Plantation custom, even for slaves, recognized that a woman needed time after birthing. She spent those days in the cabin, nursing little Samuel, singing to him in the old tongue, telling him stories about his grandmother across the great water, about the village where baobab trees grew tall and rivers ran clean and clear. "You listen to your mama now," she whispered to him, her lips against his soft head. "This world you born into is hard, harder than you can imagine yet. But you carry something precious inside you. You carry the blood of kings and queens, of warriors and conjure women, of survivors who crossed the Middle Passage and refused to die. That master's blood in your veins don't mean nothing compared to that." The other women visited when they could, bringing what little gifts they had. A carved wooden spoon from Big Samuel, a soft blanket that Clara had woven from scraps, herbs from Aunt Dinah to help Harriet's milk come strong. Young Elijah, who Harriet had healed months before, stood awkward in the doorway, shy but wanting to pay his respects. "He's gonna be strong," Elijah said, looking at the baby with wonder. "I can tell. He's got his mama's spirit in him." But the joy of those 3 days couldn't last. On the 4th morning, Overseer Hackett appeared at the door, his face cold as January frost. "Time's up. Master says you get back to work today. The baby stays here with the old woman who can't work the fields no more." Harriet's heart clenched, but she kept her face calm. This too was the way of slavery. Mothers torn from their babies, forced back to labor while their children grew up barely knowing them. She kissed Samuel's head one last time, breathed in his baby smell, then handed him to an ancient woman named Aunt Betty, who was too frail for field work but could mind infants. "Take care of my son," Harriet said, and there was steel beneath her gentle tone. "He's precious cargo, you hear?" Back in the cotton fields, Harriet worked with her body while her mind stayed in that cabin with her baby. Her breasts ached with milk that had nowhere to go. Her arms felt empty without his weight. Her heart broke anew every minute she was separated from him. But she endured, as she'd endured everything else, by calling on the ancestors for strength. It was that night when she finally returned to the cabin and held Samuel again that she made her promise. The other women had left to give her privacy, and only the crackling fire and her sleeping son bore witness to her words. "Listen to me, Samuel," she whispered, rocking him gently. "I promise you on every ancestor who watches over us, on the spirits of the earth and water, on the old gods who still remember our true names, you will not die in chains. I don't know how, and I don't know when, but somehow, someday, you gonna taste freedom. Even if I have to conjure it with my own blood, even if I have to curse every white soul on this plantation, even if I have to call down lightning from heaven itself, you will be free." The baby stirred in his sleep, made a small sound, and settled again. But in the spirit world, the ancestors heard her promise and nodded their approval. They began gathering their forces, preparing for the war that was coming, for the moment when Harriet's love would transform into a weapon more powerful than any whip or chain. But up in the big house, Miss Eliza Sinclair heard about the baby too. Heard it was a boy, heard he had features that couldn't be denied, heard the slaves whispering about how beautiful he was, how strong, and her rage, already burning hot, turned into something incandescent. She summoned Overseer Hackett to her private parlor, her pale hands trembling with fury. "I want that slave woman watched," she hissed, "every minute of every day. She's trouble, always has been. Too proud, too strange. The other slaves treat her like she's special, like she's got power. I want to know what she's doing, who she's talking to, everything." Hackett nodded, understanding the subtext beneath her words. The mistress wanted dirt on Harriet, wanted an excuse to bring her down, wanted justification for whatever terrible punishment she was planning. "Yes, ma'am, Miss Eliza. I'll put eyes on her constant-like." And so the noose began to tighten, though Harriet didn't know it yet. She was too focused on her son, on the promise she'd made, on the hope, fragile as spider silk but real nonetheless, that somehow love could triumph over the machinery of bondage that ground up black bodies and spit out profit for white men. But the ancestors knew better. They'd seen this story before, played out 1,000 times across 1,000 plantations. They knew that before this tale reached its end, that promise would be tested in ways that would break most souls. They knew that Harriet's love for her son would become the very thing Miss Eliza used to destroy her. And they knew that when that moment came, the curse Harriet had been building would be unleashed with a power that would shake the foundations of the Sinclair plantation and echo through the generations yet unborn. Now you see, people? The white folks had their ways of celebrating while we suffered, had their balls and parties where they danced and laughed and drank like the world was sweet, like there wasn't no blood on their hands, no chains in their cellars, no souls crying out from the quarters for mercy that never came. It was late October, harvest season done, when Master Sinclair announced he'd be hosting a grand ball at the big house. All the plantation owners from miles around would come with their wives dressed in silks and satins to dance and feast, while the slaves who made it all possible served them like we was invisible, like we was furniture that just happened to move and breathe. The preparations took a week. House slaves worked themselves near to death polishing silver, washing linens, cooking mountains of food that smelled so good it made your stomach ache with hunger you couldn't satisfy. Harriet and a dozen other field hands was pulled from their regular work to help. The mistress wanted everything perfect, wanted to show off her fine home and prove she was as refined as any Charleston lady. Miss Eliza herself supervised everything with eyes sharp as hawk's talons, criticizing every detail, slapping a house girl for folding a napkin wrong, screaming at the cook when the soup wasn't hot enough. But her attention kept returning to Harriet, watching her with a hatred so intense it poisoned the very air. "That one," she told her personal maid Ruth, pointing at Harriet with a finger loaded like a pistol. "I want her serving in the dining room tonight. Let's see how proud she looks when she's waiting on her betters." The night of the ball arrived like a fever dream. Carriages rolled up the drive, fine horses stamping and snorting, white folks descending in their finery, the men in black coats and high collars, the women in gowns that cost more than a slave's life, their necks dripping with jewels bought with cotton picked by bleeding hands. Music drifted from the big house, fiddles and pianos playing songs that sounded cheerful if you didn't know they was paid for with suffering. Harriet stood in the serving line with the other slaves, all of them dressed in clean clothes specially issued for the occasion, all of them with eyes downcast and faces blank. She held a silver tray loaded with crystal glasses full of champagne, the bubbles rising like tiny prayers that would never be answered. The dining room blazed with candlelight, the long table covered with food enough to feed the quarters for a month, roasted meats and glazed vegetables, cream sauces and rich desserts, wine flowing like water. The white folks sat laughing and talking, their voices loud and careless, discussing crops and horses and politics while completely ignoring the black hands that served them. Master Sinclair sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with drink and pride, playing the generous host. Miss Eliza sat beside him in a gown of emerald green, her pale throat circled with pearls, her smile fixed and brittle as glass. But her eyes, Lord have mercy, her eyes burned with something dark and terrible whenever they landed on Harriet. Harriet moved through the room like a ghost, offering champagne, clearing plates, refilling glasses. She heard snatches of conversation that made her blood boil, talk of good breeding stock and troublesome bucks, and keeping slaves in their place. These people discussed human beings the way farmers discussed livestock, with the same casual cruelty, the same complete absence of empathy. One older gentleman, drunk and red-faced, grabbed Harriet's wrist as she passed. "This one's a pretty thing, Sinclair. Where'd you get her?" Master Sinclair barely glanced up. "Charleston auction couple years back. Good worker, no real trouble." "I'll say," the man leered, his grip tightening. "Bet she warms more than just the cotton fields, eh?" The table erupted in laughter. Cruel, knowing laughter that spoke volumes about what these white men considered their rights. Harriet stood frozen, her face carefully blank, while inside she was calling on every ounce of self-control not to pour that silver tray of hot soup over the man's head. But it was Miss Eliza's reaction that told the real story. Her face went white, then red, her jaw clenching so tight you could hear her teeth grinding. She set down her fork with exaggerated care and spoke in a voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Harriet, dear," she said, drawing out the words, "come stand here beside me a moment." Harriet approached, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. The whole table went quiet, sensing something about to happen, the way animals sense a storm coming. Miss Eliza looked up at her with eyes like chips of ice. "Tell me, girl, do you think you're special? Do you think that just because you can birth a baby and work a field that you're worth more than any other piece of property on this plantation?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Harriet kept her eyes down, knowing that any answer was a trap. "No, ma'am," she said quietly. "No, ma'am," Miss Eliza mimicked, her voice dripping with contempt. "You stand there with your proud African face thinking thoughts you got no business thinking, acting like you're better than you are. But let me tell you something, girl. You ain't nothing. You hear me? Nothing but property, same as a horse or a plow." The other guests shifted uncomfortably, this display of cruelty too raw even for their hardened sensibilities. But Miss Eliza wasn't finished. She stood up, walked over to Harriet, and with no warning at all, slapped her hard across the face. The sound cracked through the dining room like a whip. Harriet's head snapped to the side, her cheek burning, but she didn't cry out, didn't raise a hand to defend herself. She just stood there, taking it, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the walls, beyond this world. "That's for forgetting your place," Miss Eliza hissed, "and there's more where that came from if you don't learn proper respect." Master Sinclair finally intervened, embarrassed by his wife's public loss of control. "Now, Eliza, that's enough." The girl meant no offense, but Miss Eliza whirled on him, her face twisted with rage and something deeper, pain perhaps, or the humiliation of knowing her husband preferred a slave to her own bed. "Don't you defend her, Jeremiah. Don't you dare." The party dissolved into awkward silence after that. Soon the guests made their excuses and left, leaving behind half-eaten food and the wreckage of Miss Eliza's composure. The slaves cleared the table in tense silence, knowing that when white folks fought, it was always the slaves who paid the price. As the last dish was washed and the last candle extinguished, Harriet finally made her way back toward the quarters. But as she passed the barn, a hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed her arm. It was Miss Eliza, alone in the shadows, her fancy gown dirty at the hem, her hair coming loose from its pins. "You think this is over?" she whispered, her breath smelling of wine and hatred. "You think you can bewitch my husband and birth his bastard and walk around like you own this place?" Harriet met her eyes then, and what Miss Eliza saw there made her step back, the accumulated power of ancestors, the quiet fury of the oppressed, the promise of reckoning. "I ain't bewitched nobody, ma'am," Harriet said, her voice steady. "Your husband's sins are his own. I'm just trying to survive." Before Miss Eliza could respond, footsteps approached, Overseer Hackett checking on the commotion. The mistress stepped back, composing herself, but her eyes promised violence to come. "Get back to the quarters," she spat. Harriet walked away into the night, her face still stinging from the slap but her spirit unbroken. She knew now, with terrible certainty, that Miss Eliza wouldn't stop until she'd destroyed her completely. The confrontation was coming, the storm she'd seen in her visions, and all she could do was prepare for the moment when suffering would transform into power, when the curse she'd been building would finally be unleashed. Sweet Jesus, mercy me. This here is the part that even now makes my old bones shake, makes my voice tremble when I speak of it. What happened that November night was cruelty so pure it seemed to come straight from the devil's own playbook. But child, listen close, because this is also where power was born, where a curse took root that would shake the foundations of evil itself. 3 nights after the ball, Miss Eliza couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think of nothing but her rage at Harriet, at her husband, at the whole twisted world that gave men like Jeremiah Sinclair the right to violate slave women while their wives suffered in silent humiliation. That poison had been festering in her heart for months, and now it was ready to burst like an infected wound. She sent word through Overseer Hackett. Harriet was to come to the barn after dark, alone, to help move some supplies. It was a thin excuse, but slaves didn't question orders from the big house. You did what you was told, or you faced the whipping post. Harriet knew it was a trap the moment she heard. The ancestors had shown her this night in visions, had prepared her for what was coming. As she walked through the darkness toward the barn, she whispered prayers in the old tongue, calling on Oya the warrior, on Ogun the iron worker, on all the spirits who knew suffering and survival. Her hand touched the mojo bag hidden in her dress. Gopher dust and graveyard dirt, roots and bones, power accumulated over months of preparation. The barn loomed dark and silent, its doors open like a mouth waiting to swallow her. Harriet stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the deeper darkness within. Then she saw them. Miss Eliza standing near the back wall, her pale face ghostly in the moonlight filtering through the cracks, and beside her Overseer Hackett with a length of rope in his hands. "There she is," Miss Eliza said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "The African witch who thinks she can steal what's mine." Harriet stood tall, her eyes meeting the mistress's gaze without flinching. "I ain't stole nothing, ma'am. Whatever sin's been committed here, they ain't mine." "Liar!" Miss Eliza shrieked, her composure finally shattering completely. "You put a spell on my husband, used your African devilry to make him forget his Christian duty. That baby you birthed is proof of your witchcraft." Hackett moved fast then, grabbing Harriet from behind, his strong arms pinning hers. She didn't fight. What was the point? They could kill her right here and nobody would say a word. Nobody would ask questions. This was the power of slavery, the absolute dominion of white over black, and resistance only made the suffering last longer. They forced her down onto the dirt floor, Hackett holding her shoulders while Miss Eliza stood over her, breathing hard, eyes wild with madness that had been building for too long. "You think you're special," the mistress hissed. "You think those eyes of yours see something we can't. Well, let's see how special you are when you can't see nothing at all." That's when she pulled it from her pocket. A rusty nail, long as a finger, corroded and jagged, pulled from some forgotten corner of the barn. The sight of it made even Hackett hesitate. "Ma'am," he said uncertainly, "maybe we should just—" "Hold her," Miss Eliza commanded, and there was something in her voice that brooked no argument, something that said she'd gone past the point of reason into territory where only vengeance mattered. What happened next, child, was horror beyond words. Miss Eliza knelt down, that rusty nail gripped tight in her pale fist, and while Harriet struggled and Hackett held her down, the mistress went for her eyes. The pain, Lord of Glory. The pain was beyond anything human language can describe. Fire and ice and lightning all at once, the feeling of something precious being torn away, darkness rushing in like a flood. Harriet screamed then, screamed with all the anguish of the Middle Passage, all the suffering of every slave who'd ever been brutalized, all the rage of ancestors watching their children destroyed. But she didn't beg. Even as blood poured down her face, even as sight left her forever, she didn't plead for mercy. Instead, as the pain reached its crescendo and the darkness became absolute, Harriet spoke. Her voice came out low and terrible, words in the old tongue mixing with English, power crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. The ancestors were speaking through her now, lending their voices to hers, and what came out was a curse so powerful it made the barn itself shudder. "You done took my sight, Sinha," Harriet rasped, blood coating her lips. "But I curse you with the eyes of the ancestors. May every slave you ever wronged haunt your waking hours and your dreams. May madness devour your mind like cancer eats flesh. May you see the chains you forged, feel the whip you ordered, taste the suffering you caused. May your own reflection become a horror to you. May mirrors show you truth your soul can't bear. May you wither and waste, may your body betray you, may your mind crack and shatter till you perish screaming in the void, alone and abandoned by God and man alike. This I swear by the spirits of the water that brought me here in chains, by the earth that drinks our blood, by the ancestors who watch and remember. You will suffer as we have suffered, and your suffering will be legend." The words hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment everything went still. Miss Eliza staggered backward, the bloody nail falling from her hand, her face pale as death. Even Hackett released his grip on Harriet, suddenly afraid of what they'd done, of what they'd unleashed. She's cursing me," Miss Eliza whispered, touching her own face as if to make sure it was still there. "Make her stop. Make her stop." But Harriet wasn't finished. Blind now, her face a mask of blood, she pushed herself up to sitting, her hands finding the earth beneath her. She dug her fingers into the dirt, pulling up Georgia clay mixed with her own blood, and began marking symbols, old African symbols that predated the ships, that called on powers deeper than slavery, older than America itself. "The curse is set," she said, her voice eerily calm now, almost peaceful. "Already it grows in your soul like rotten wood. You'll see, Sinha. Oh, you'll see what I see now. The truth behind the lies, the suffering behind the silk, the blood on your hands that no amount of washing can clean." Hackett dragged Miss Eliza from the barn, the mistress babbling and crying. But Harriet barely noticed. She sat there in the darkness that would be her companion forever now, feeling the power of the curse spreading out like roots from a tree, burrowing into Miss Eliza's spirit, finding every crack and weakness, preparing to split her apart from the inside. Eventually, other slaves found her. Big Samuel and Clara, alerted by the screams, came running. They found Harriet sitting in her own blood, blind and broken in body, but with something fierce and terrible burning in her spirit. "Lord God," Clara wept, seeing Harriet's ruined face. "What they done to you, sister?" Harriet reached out, found Clara's hand, gripped it tight. "They took my eyes," she said. "But they gave me something more powerful. They gave me the right to curse without mercy, to call down judgment without guilt. And that curse, Clara, that curse will eat Miss Eliza alive. Just you wait and see." They carried her back to the quarters, and Aunt Dinah did what she could to clean the wounds, to stop the bleeding, to keep infection from taking hold. But they all knew Harriet would never see again in this world. The light was gone forever, replaced by darkness absolute. But in that darkness, something else was growing. Harriet's other senses sharpened, her connection to the spirit world deepened, her power multiplied tenfold. The ancestors had promised this, that great suffering would birth great power, that loss would become strength, that blindness would transform into vision clearer than sight ever was. And up in the big house, Miss Eliza lay in her bed, unable to sleep, staring at shadows on the ceiling that seemed to move and writhe. She could still hear Harriet's voice, still feel the weight of that curse settling over her like a shroud. And though she told herself it was superstition, just African foolishness with no real power, somewhere deep in her soul she knew the truth. She'd just sealed her own doom, and the reckoning was coming. Now listen here, child, 'cause this is where the story takes a turn that even the oldest among us had never seen before. What happened to Harriet in that barn should have broken her, should have left her helpless and destroyed. But the ancestors work in mysterious ways, and sometimes what looks like the end is really just the beginning. For days after the horror, Harriet lay in her cabin, blind and fevered, hovering between this world and the next. Aunt Dinah tended her wounds with poultices made from roots and herbs, whispered prayers over her, begged the spirits to spare her life. The quarters held its collective breath, waiting to see if Harriet would survive, or if Miss Eliza's cruelty would claim another victim. But on the 5th day, Harriet sat up. Her face was scarred where the nail had torn, her eye sockets covered with clean cloth, but there was something different about her. A stillness, a power that radiated from her like heat from fire. "I can see," she whispered, and Aunt Dinah nearly dropped the bowl of broth she was carrying. "Child, you ain't making sense. The fever's got you confused." Harriet turned her head toward Dinah's voice with eerie precision. "I can't see with flesh eyes no more, that's true. But I see other things now, clearer than I ever did before. I see spirits walking among us. I see the threads that connect all living things. I see the future unfolding like a map, and the past hanging over this plantation like smoke that won't clear." The old woman sat down heavily, understanding washing over her like cold water. The gift that Harriet had always possessed, the sight, the connection to the spirit world, had been amplified 100-fold by her suffering. The ancestors had taken her physical vision and replaced it with something far more powerful. Word spread through the quarters like wildfire. Harriet could see despite her blindness, could navigate the cabin without stumbling, could tell who approached before they spoke. More than that, she could see into hearts, could read the truth beneath lies, could divine the future with accuracy that terrified even those who loved her. When Overseer Hackett came checking on her, expecting to find a broken woman fit only for the most menial tasks, he found instead Harriet standing in her cabin doorway, her blind face turned toward him with such intensity he stepped back involuntarily. "Careful where you walk, Mr. Hackett," she said softly. "The path ahead of you is shorter than you think, and it ends in darkness." The overseer felt a chill run down his spine. "You threatening me, gal?" "No, sir," Harriet replied, her voice calm as still water. "Just telling you what I see. The spirits don't lie, and they show me you ain't long for this world. Drink's gonna take you before next harvest. Your liver's already rotting inside you." Hackett backed away, muttering about witchcraft and devil's work, but his hand shook as he reached for his flask. The one he kept hidden from Master Sinclair, the one that never left his side. He'd die 8 months later, just as Harriet predicted, his body consumed by the poison he'd poured into it year after year. But it was in the quarters at night that Harriet truly became what she was meant to be. The slaves gathered in her cabin after dark, seeking healing, guidance, protection. She made mojo bags with hands that no longer needed eyes to work, mixed herbs and roots with the precision of long practice, spoke prayers and incantations that made the air shimmer with power. "My blindness is my strength," she told them. What Miss Eliza meant for destruction, the ancestors transformed into vision. "I see past the veil now, children. I walk with one foot in this world and one in the spirit realm, and ain't nobody, not master nor overseer nor mistress, can take that away from me." Clara came to her one night, worried about her oldest child who'd been sold off to Mississippi years before. "Can you see him?" she asked, voice breaking with hope and fear. "Can you tell me if he's still alive?" Harriet held Clara's hands, went still and quiet, her consciousness drifting across distances no physical eye could travel. When she spoke again, her voice came from somewhere far away. "He lives, sister, works in a sawmill near Natchez. He's grown tall, strong like his mama. He remembers you, carries your face in his heart. And one day, I see it clear, one day he'll be free, gonna walk out of bondage and make his way north to Ohio. Hold on to that promise, Clara, hold tight." Clara wept then, tears of sorrow and relief mixed together, and she wasn't the only one who came seeking Harriet's sight. Young lovers wanted to know if their secret courtships would end in marriage or separation. Pregnant women wanted to know if their babies would survive. Old folks wanted to know if freedom would come in their lifetime. Harriet answered them all truthfully, even when the truth was hard. She'd learned that the ancestors demanded honesty, that sugarcoating visions was an insult to their power. But she also offered hope where she could, showed them paths they hadn't seen, gave them strength to endure. The other slaves began calling her Mother Harriet, treating her with a reverence usually reserved for elders and root doctors. Big Samuel appointed himself her guardian, making sure nobody bothered her when she needed rest, bringing her food and water, protecting her from those who might try to take advantage of her blindness. But Harriet didn't need much protecting. Her other senses had sharpened to an almost supernatural degree. She could hear heartbeats from across a room, could smell fear and lies, could feel the vibrations of footsteps through the earth, and know who approached. She navigated the plantation grounds with confidence that astounded those who watched, moving through darkness as if she could see every stone and root. And her connection to little Samuel, her son, became something precious and powerful. Though she could no longer see his face, she knew him by his smell, his breathing, the particular way his small heart beat against her chest when she held him. She sang to him in the old tongue, taught him to feel the spirits around them, promised him again and again that freedom would come. But while the quarters saw Harriet's transformation as blessing, up in the big house, Miss Eliza was experiencing something very different. The curse had taken root and begun its terrible work. It started with nightmares. Every time Miss Eliza closed her eyes, she saw them. Hundreds of chained figures marching through her dreams, their faces accusing, their eyes burning with judgment. She heard the crack of whips, the screams of mothers separated from children, the splash of bodies hitting ocean water during the middle passage. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced she could smell the quarters. That mixture of sweat and smoke and suffering, seeping through her bedroom walls. She'd look in her mirror and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, she'd see not her own reflection but Harriet's ruined face staring back at her. Her personal maid Ruth found her one morning, standing before the mirror, scratching at her own face. "They're watching me," Miss Eliza whispered. "All those black eyes watching and waiting and judging. Make them stop, Ruth. Please make them stop." Ruth tried to comfort her mistress, but she knew the truth. She'd heard about Harriet's curse, had seen the power in it, understood that Miss Eliza had brought this on herself by her cruelty. And deep in her heart, Ruth felt no sympathy. This was justice, terrible and complete. Master Sinclair noticed his wife's deterioration, but attributed it to nerves, to the natural sensitivity of refined white women. He called for the doctor, who prescribed laudanum and bed rest, but nothing helped. The curse ran deeper than medicine could reach, burrowed into Miss Eliza's soul, where no tonic or prayer could touch it. At night, when the big house was dark and quiet, Miss Eliza would stand at her bedroom window, looking out toward the quarters. And sometimes, she swore this was true, though nobody believed her, she could see a figure standing in the darkness, a blind woman with her face turned toward the big house, as if those missing eyes could still see, could still watch, could still judge. "She's cursing me," Miss Eliza told her husband, her voice high and desperate. "That slave woman, she's doing African witchcraft on me. You have to stop her, sell her, kill her, something." But Sinclair refused, partly because he didn't believe in curses, partly because Harriet was still valuable property despite her blindness. The other slaves worked harder when she was among them, and her presence seemed to keep unrest from bubbling over into outright rebellion. So the curse continued its work, patient and inexorable as time itself. And Harriet, in her darkness, smiled a smile that contained no humor. Only the grim satisfaction of seeing justice, however terrible, finally being served. Lord have mercy, sweet Jesus. This here is the part of the story that cuts deepest, child. The part that shows just how cruel this peculiar institution could be. How it turned human hearts to stone and made monsters out of folks who called themselves Christian. Spring came to Georgia with mockingbirds singing and magnolias blooming white as bone. But there was no beauty in it for Harriet. 6 months had passed since the night in the barn. 6 months of living in darkness while her inner sight grew stronger. 6 months of watching Miss Eliza descend deeper into madness. But Harriet's curse hadn't brought her peace. It had only marked her as dangerous, made her a target for cruelty even more terrible than what had come before. Little Samuel was nearly 2 years old now, a bright child who laughed easy and loved hard, who followed his mama around the quarters calling "Mama, Mama," in a voice that made even the hardest heart soften. Harriet knew every inch of him by touch, the soft curls of his hair, the dimple in his left cheek, the way his small hands gripped her fingers when he was scared. But she also knew, with the terrible certainty of her visions, what was coming. The ancestors had shown her in dreams that made her wake up screaming, had warned her that the worst pain was yet to arrive. She'd tried to prepare herself, tried to harden her heart against the inevitable, But a mother's love ain't something you can just turn off like a lamp. It was Miss Eliza who ordered it, of course. Her madness had evolved from nightmares into full-blown obsession. She blamed Harriet for everything wrong in her life, saw the blind conjure woman as the source of all her suffering, and she'd figured out the one thing that could hurt Harriet worse than tearing out her eyes, taking away her son. That boy, Miss Eliza told her husband over breakfast one morning, her hands shaking so bad she could barely hold her teacup. He's proof of your sin, Jeremiah. Proof that you violated our marriage bed with that African witch. I can't bear to look at him another day. Sell him. Sell him far away where I never have to think about him again. Master Sinclair protested weakly. The boy was his blood after all, even if born on the wrong side of the sheets. But Miss Eliza was relentless, her voice rising to a shriek that brought the house slaves running. Sell him or I'll leave you. I swear to God, Jeremiah. I'll go back to Charleston and tell everyone what kind of man you are. Sell that bastard child or lose everything. In the end, greed and reputation won out over whatever faint stirring of conscience Sinclair might have had. He sent word to a slave trader passing through on his way to the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, places where the work was harder and the life expectancy shorter, where young boys was bought up cheap to work the cane fields till they dropped. The trader arrived on a Tuesday morning, a hard-faced man named Cyrus Blackwell, who dealt in human flesh the way butchers dealt in cattle. He examined Samuel with cold eyes, checking his teeth, his limbs, looking for defects that might lower the price. $200, Blackwell offered. He's young yet, but he'll grow strong if he survives. Good investment for a cane plantation. Harriet knew before anyone told her. She was in the cotton fields when the vision hit her like a physical blow. She saw the trader's wagon, saw little Samuel crying, saw the road stretching south toward a suffering she couldn't prevent. She dropped her picking sack and ran, blind feet flying over ground she knew by heart, running toward the quarters where her baby was playing. But she was too late. When she arrived, breathless and terrified, Big Samuel grabbed her arms to hold her back. "Don't, sister," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't make it harder than it already is." Harriet could hear her son crying, could hear the trader's gruff voice, could hear the clink of coins changing hands. "Samuel!" she screamed, her voice raw with anguish. "My baby, please, please don't take my baby." They brought the child to her for one last moment. That was the only mercy they showed. Harriet fell to her knees, pulling Samuel into her arms, breathing in his smell, feeling his tears wet against her neck as he cried for his mama. "Hush now, baby," she whispered, though her own voice shook with sobs. "Hush now. Mama loves you. Mama will always love you. You be strong, you hear me? You remember where you come from. You remember you got ancestors watching over you. You remember that you're precious cargo, that you carry the blood of kings." But Samuel was only 2 years old, too young to understand, too young to remember these words when he needed them most. He just cried and clung to her, and when the trader's hands pulled him away, when they pried his small fingers from her dress, his screams echoed across the plantation like a prophecy of judgment. They loaded him into the wagon with 3 other children being sold south, all of them crying, all of them calling for mamas who couldn't save them, all of them disappearing into the machinery of slavery that ground up families and spit out profit. Harriet stood there in the yard, her blind face turned toward the sound of the departing wagon, tears streaming down her scarred cheeks. The other slaves gathered around her, Clara weeping, Aunt Dinah praying, Big Samuel's strong hands on her shoulders. But nothing could ease this pain. Nothing could fill the hole torn in her heart. The auction block's cruelty had struck again, tearing mother from child in the most fundamental violation of human love. And this time, it wasn't some distant trauma from the past. It was happening now, to her baby, and there was nothing her powers could do to stop it. That night, when the quarters was dark and quiet, when everyone else had fallen into exhausted sleep, Harriet knelt on the dirt floor of her cabin. She reached into the earth with her bare hands, pulling up Georgia clay still warm from the day's sun, and began working a conjure like none she'd done before. She mixed the clay with her own tears, with blood drawn from her palm, with herbs gathered under the dark of the moon. She spoke words that came from deep in her soul, words the ancestors themselves seemed to whisper through her lips. "Miss Eliza," she said, her voice cold and terrible as winter wind. "You done took my sight, and now you took my son. But I swear by every spirit that watches, by every ancestor that guards me, by every power in heaven and earth, you will pay. The curse I laid on you before was just the beginning. Now I curse you complete and total. May madness consume you utterly. May you claw at your own flesh till you bleed. May mirrors crack at the sight of you. May your mind shatter like glass. May you die alone and terrified, abandoned by God and man, your last breath a scream that echoes through eternity." The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy, charged with power that made the very walls tremble. In the spirit world, the ancestors gathered their forces, adding their voices to Harriet's curse, feeding it with the accumulated rage of centuries of suffering. And up in the big house, Miss Eliza woke from sleep screaming, clawing at invisible chains wrapped around her throat, seeing faces in the darkness. Hundreds of faces, thousands, all the slaves her family had owned and destroyed over generations, all of them watching, waiting, judging. The curse had reached its full power now, and nothing in heaven or earth could stop what was coming. Now you see, people, when a curse gets fed with a mother's grief, when it's watered with tears shed for a stolen child, it grows into something that can't be reasoned with, can't be stopped, can't be turned back. Miss Eliza was about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. The changes started small, but grew like kudzu vine, spreading and choking everything in their path. Miss Eliza stopped sleeping altogether. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the middle passage, felt herself chained in a ship's hold, surrounded by dying bodies and the stench of despair. She'd wake up gasping, convinced she could smell the ocean, taste salt water mixed with blood. Her personal maid Ruth found her one morning standing in front of her bedroom mirror, both hands pressed against the glass, whispering to her own reflection. "They're in there," Miss Eliza said, her voice high and childlike. "Behind the glass, hundreds of them watching me with dead eyes. Can't you see them, Ruth? Can't you see?" Ruth saw only her mistress's haggard reflection, face pale as milk, hair wild and uncombed, eyes ringed with dark circles that looked like bruises. "No, ma'am," she said quietly. "I don't see nothing but you." But Miss Eliza insisted. She had all the mirrors in the house covered with cloth, claiming they were portals for spirits to watch her through. When Master Sinclair objected, she flew into a rage so violent he had to physically restrain her, her fingernails drawing blood as she clawed at his face. The doctor came again, prescribed stronger laudanum, suggested perhaps a stay at a sanatorium in Charleston where nervous ladies went to recover their health. But Miss Eliza refused to leave the plantation, convinced that if she went away, the slaves would perform rituals that would kill her from a distance. "It's that blind witch," she told anyone who'd listen. "Harriet, the one who cursed me. She's doing this with her African magic, calling up demons to torment me. You have to stop her, sell her, kill her, burn her alive. I don't care how, just make it stop." But Master Sinclair, for all his faults, wasn't fool enough to murder valuable property based on his wife's delusions. He did increase Overseer Hackett's surveillance of Harriet, though by now Hackett was drinking so heavy his hands shook, and his judgment was clouded. The Overseer was fighting his own demons, the ones Harriet had predicted would kill him before harvest. In the quarters at night, the slaves whispered about what was happening in the big house. Word spread through the network of house servants, how Miss Eliza screamed at invisible tormentors, how she refused to eat for fear the food was poisoned with gopher dust, how she'd been found wandering the grounds at midnight in her nightgown, digging in the dirt for the conjure bags she was convinced Harriet had buried to curse her. "The spirits are taking their due," Aunt Dinah said solemnly. "What goes around comes around, and Miss Eliza sent a whole lot of evil into this world. Now it's coming back to collect." But the worst manifestation came on a night when the moon hung full and heavy in the sky, when the air was thick enough to choke on. Miss Eliza was in her bedroom, pacing back and forth, muttering prayers and curses mixed together in a stream of madness. Suddenly, she stopped, her eyes fixed on the window. There, standing in the yard below, illuminated by moonlight, was Harriet. The blind woman stood perfectly still, her scarred face turned upward toward the big house, and even though she had no eyes, Miss Eliza could feel the weight of her gaze, could feel the power radiating from her like heat from a forge. "No," Miss Eliza whispered, backing away from the window. "No, no, no, you can't see me, you're blind." But Harriet raised one hand slowly, pointing directly at Miss Eliza's window. And in that moment, the mistress knew beyond any doubt, that whatever sight the blind woman possessed now was far more terrible than physical vision ever could be. Miss Eliza screamed then, a sound so piercing it woke the whole house. She grabbed a candlestick from her nightstand and threw it at the window, shattering the glass. "Get away from me, demon, witch, leave me alone." Master Sinclair came running, found his wife in hysterics, pointing at the yard where nothing stood but shadows and moonlight. "She was there!" Miss Eliza shrieked. "That blind slave woman standing there watching me with her devil eyes!" Sinclair looked out but saw nothing. Down in the quarters, Harriet sat peacefully in her cabin, her hands folded in her lap, a small smile on her lips. She hadn't moved from that spot all night, didn't need to. The curse had grown strong enough to create visions, to plant images in Miss Eliza's mind that felt more real than reality itself. The plantation began to suffer as Miss Eliza's madness deepened. She fired house slaves on a whim, accusing them of working conjure against her. She ordered punishments for infractions that hadn't happened, seeing conspiracies and plots that existed only in her deteriorating mind. Master Sinclair tried to maintain order, but his wife's erratic behavior was undermining his authority. One morning, Miss Eliza came down from her bedroom with her hair turned completely white overnight. She stood in the dining room doorway, skeletal thin from refusing food, her once beautiful face now a mask of terror and madness. "The chains," she whispered, holding up her wrists for her husband to see. "Can't you see the chains? They're on me now, locked tight. I can feel the weight of them pulling me down into the dark." Sinclair saw no chains, only his wife's bony wrists marked with scratches where she'd clawed at her own skin trying to remove shackles that weren't there. This was the curse working its deepest magic, making the oppressor feel what the oppressed had felt, forcing Miss Eliza to experience in her mind what she'd helped inflict on others in flesh. She began spending hours in her room, talking to people who weren't there. The house slaves would pass by her door and hear her carrying on conversations with ghosts, begging for forgiveness, pleading for mercy, promising to free all the slaves if only the voices would stop. But the voices never stopped. They multiplied, grew louder, more insistent. They spoke in languages she didn't know, African tongues that the Middle Passage had tried to silence, slave languages born from pain and survival. They whispered her sins back to her in excruciating detail, showed her every cruelty she'd committed or condoned, made her feel the weight of every chain her family had locked on human flesh. Ruth, the maid who'd served her for years, felt no pity. She'd seen too much, endured too much to sympathize with a woman reaping what she'd sown. "The ancestors are speaking," Ruth told the other house slaves. "They're calling Miss Eliza to account, and ain't nothing she can do but listen till it drives her past the edge of reason." One night, in a moment of terrible clarity, Miss Eliza realized what she had to do to make it stop. She had to kill Harriet, had to destroy the source of the curse before it destroyed her completely. She took a kitchen knife from the drawer, hid it in the folds of her nightgown, and slipped out of the big house while her husband slept. The quarters was dark and still when she arrived, barefoot and wild-eyed, the knife gripped tight in her trembling hand. She moved like a ghost through the shadows, guided by madness and desperation, until she found Harriet's cabin. But when she pushed open the door, when she stepped inside ready to plunge that blade into the blind woman's heart, she found Harriet waiting for her, sitting calm in the darkness, as if she'd known all along that this moment would come. "Hello, Signa," Harriet said softly. "I've been expecting you." "Don't tell me that. You think this story ends with murder in the quarters? No, child. The ancestors had other plans. What happened that night between Harriet and Miss Eliza wasn't what either of them expected, and it changed the course of everything that followed. Miss Eliza stood frozen in Harriet's cabin doorway, the knife trembling in her hand, her mind warring between the desire to kill and the paralyzing fear of this blind woman who somehow knew she was coming. In the dim light of dying coals, Harriet's scarred face looked almost peaceful, as if death held no terror for her anymore. "How did you know?" Miss Eliza whispered, her voice cracking. "The ancestors told me," Harriet said simply. "They show me everything now, Sinha. Every thought in your head, every nightmare that haunts you, every ghost that calls your name. I see it all, clearer than I ever saw with flesh eyes." Miss Eliza laughed then, a sound like breaking glass. "Then you see I'm going to kill you. You see that blade in my hand, you see what I came here to do." "I see you want to kill me," Harriet corrected gently. "But wanting and doing ain't the same thing. Come on now, Sinha. If you're gonna do it, do it. But know that killing me won't stop the curse. It'll only make it stronger, seal it permanent in the earth and the air and the water of this plantation. My death would be the final ingredient, the last piece needed to make your suffering eternal." The knife wavered. Miss Eliza took a step forward, then stopped, her whole body shaking. "I can't live like this anymore," she sobbed. "The voices, the visions, the chains I feel but can't see. I'm losing my mind, and you did this to me. You cursed me." "You cursed yourself," Harriet said, and there was no anger in her voice, just tired truth. "You took my eyes with a rusty nail, Sinha. You sold my child south to suffer and die. You think the universe don't notice them kind of sins? You think there's no accounting for cruelty?" Miss Eliza collapsed to her knees, the knife clattering to the floor. She sat there weeping, this pale ghost of a woman who'd once been the mistress of the plantation, now reduced to nothing but pain and madness. And Harriet, blind but seeing everything, felt something unexpected stir in her heart. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of shared suffering. "The curse stands," Harriet said quietly. "What's done is done. But I can ease it some, make the spirits quiet enough you can sleep at night. Not for you, Sinha, you don't deserve my help. But because I'm tired of the killing, tired of the suffering, tired of this whole cursed system that destroys everyone it touches." She reached out, found Miss Eliza's trembling hand, and held it for a moment. The touch sent visions flooding between them. Harriet saw Miss Eliza's childhood, saw how she'd been raised to see slaves as property, saw how her own powerlessness as a white woman in a man's world had twisted into cruelty toward those even more powerless. And Miss Eliza for the first time saw through Harriet's eyes, felt the middle passage, the auction block, the violation, the blinding. They both pulled back, gasping, changed by what they'd witnessed. Miss Eliza stumbled out of the cabin without another word, leaving the knife behind, and Harriet sat alone in the darkness, wondering if maybe, just maybe, the cycle of vengeance could be broken before it consumed them all. But that moment of almost mercy was brief. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Word had reached the plantation about the Underground Railroad, about a new conductor operating in Georgia, about slaves disappearing into the night and making their way north to freedom. Young Elijah came to Harriet in the fields, his voice low and urgent. "Sister, I seen the way. I met a man last night, at the edge of the woods. He says there's a path, a network of safe houses running all the way to Ohio. He says folks who brave enough can walk out of bondage, can follow the North Star to freedom." Harriet's heart quickened. She'd seen this in her visions, had known it was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way dreams never could. "Who is this man?" she asked. Wouldn't give his name, just said to look for the signs, marks on trees, coded songs, signals that show the way. Said we gotta move fast though before the paddy rollers get wise to the route. That night, Harriet gathered the trusted ones in her cabin. Clara, Big Samuel, Aunt Dinah, Elijah, and a few others who'd proven their courage and commitment. She told them about the vision she'd been carrying since her son was taken, the vision of walking out of Georgia toward a land where black folks could be free. "I can't promise we all make it," she said honestly. "The road north is dangerous, full of slave catchers, paddy rollers, rivers to cross, mountains to climb. But staying here? That's a slower death, a lifetime of watching our children sold south, our backs scarred from whips, our spirits broken piece by piece." Big Samuel spoke the question they were all thinking. What about the others? The ones too old or too young or too scared to run? "We take who we can," Harriet said. "The ancestors will guide us, will show us who's meant to walk this path. But I won't force nobody. Freedom's got to be chosen, not commanded." Over the next weeks, while continuing her work in the fields by day, Harriet began preparing for the journey by night. She gathered herbs for healing, made mojo bags for protection, memorized the routes the conductor had shown Elijah. She taught herself to navigate by sound and smell and the feel of the earth beneath her feet, practiced moving through the woods silent as shadow. She also continued her work as a healer, tending to the sick and injured, brewing remedies from roots and barks, speaking prayers that eased suffering. This was her dual purpose now, preparing for escape while maintaining hope for those who would stay behind. One evening, an older man named Moses came to her with a twisted leg that pained him something terrible. As Harriet worked her healing poultice into his scarred flesh, he spoke quietly about his own dreams of freedom. "I'm too old to run," he said. "Body's too broken from years in the fields, but you, Harriet, you still young enough, strong enough. You got that sight that could guide others through the dark. Maybe you're meant to be like your namesake, like Harriet Tubman, who they say conducts folks north." The name sparked something in Harriet's memory. She'd heard whispers of another Harriet, a woman who'd escaped slavery and returned again and again to lead others to freedom. The coincidence of the name felt like destiny, like the ancestors pointing her toward her true purpose. "When the time comes," she told Moses, "I'll remember you in my prayers. And if I make it north, if I taste freedom, I'll come back for more. I swear it on my son's name. I won't rest till every chain is broken, till every slave knows the taste of liberty." But her plans were interrupted by a commotion from the big house. Screams echoed across the plantation. Not Miss Eliza's usual night terrors, but something different, something urgent and terrible. The slaves looked at each other with knowing eyes. The curse was reaching its climax, and before Harriet could lead anyone to freedom, she would have to witness the final destruction of the woman who'd taken her eyes and stolen her child. Good God Almighty, gather close now, children, 'cause this is where the curse reaches its terrible fullness, where Miss Eliza's descent into madness becomes complete, where the spirits of the ancestors claim what's owed them in blood and suffering. It happened on a night when the wind howled through the Georgia pines like souls crying out for justice, when lightning split the sky and thunder shook the earth. The slaves huddled in their cabins, knowing that storms like this carried power beyond the natural world, knowing that when the ancestors got riled up, the very heavens trembled. Up in the big house, Miss Eliza had been locked in her bedroom for 3 days. Master Sinclair had finally admitted his wife needed more help than any country doctor could provide, had written to Charleston about arrangements for a sanatorium, but the letter sat undelivered on his desk, because what happened that night made all such plans meaningless. Ruth, the personal maid, heard it first, a sound like an animal caught in a trap, high and desperate and full of pain. She rushed to Miss Eliza's door, found it locked from the inside, pounded on the wood while calling her mistress's name. "Miss Eliza, ma'am, open this door." But the only answer was more screaming, interspersed with words in a language Ruth didn't recognize. Later, she'd swear it sounded like African tongues, like Miss Eliza was speaking in the voices of the very slaves she'd tormented. Master Sinclair came running, threw his shoulder against the door until the lock broke. What they found inside would haunt Ruth's dreams for the rest of her life. Miss Eliza stood in the center of the room, her white nightgown torn and bloody, her face a mask of absolute terror. She'd been clawing at her own skin, tearing at her hair, scratching deep gouges in her arms and face as if trying to remove something invisible that crawled beneath her flesh. But worse than the physical damage was her eyes. They'd gone completely wild, seeing horrors that existed only in her cursed mind. She pointed at empty corners, at shadows on the walls, screaming about chains and ships and drowning, about auction blocks and whipping posts, about mothers torn from babies and families destroyed. "They're here!" she shrieked, backing against the wall. "All of them. Every slave that ever suffered on this plantation. They're reaching for me, pulling me down into the hold of the ship. I can smell it, the death, the fear, the suffering. Make them stop. Please, somebody make them stop." She ran at the window then, pure instinct driving her, trying to escape the phantoms only she could see. Sinclair grabbed her, but she fought like a woman possessed. And maybe she was. Maybe the ancestors had taken up residence in her very bones, speaking through her mouth, showing her visions through her eyes. "The blind woman!" Miss Eliza gasped, her strength finally giving out. "She did this. Her curse, her conjure, her African devilry. She called them up from hell to torment me. Kill her. You have to kill her before she destroys me completely." But even as she spoke, even as Sinclair held his sobbing wife against his chest, they both knew the truth. Killing Harriet wouldn't stop this. The curse had roots too deep now, branches too widespread. It had become part of the very air they breathed, the ground they walked on. Down in the quarters, Harriet sat in her cabin with Aunt Dinah and Clara, listening to the storm rage outside and feeling the curse reach its crescendo. She hadn't called the storm. Oya, the warrior spirit, had done that herself, riding the wind to claim what was hers. "It's happening," Harriet said quietly. "The final breaking. Miss Eliza's mind is shattering like glass, and there ain't no putting it back together." Aunt Dinah shook her head, her old face troubled. "Lord have mercy on her soul, even though she showed none to us." But Clara spoke what many were thinking. She deserves every moment of suffering, every vision, every terror, every phantom that haunts her. She earned it with her cruelty. Harriet said nothing, just sat listening to the storm and the screams carrying faintly from the big house. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction in Miss Eliza's destruction, just a deep weariness, a recognition that this cycle of suffering and vengeance solved nothing, freed no one, healed no wounds. The storm raged through the night, and when dawn finally broke gray and exhausted over the plantation, word spread quickly. Miss Eliza had gone completely clean out of her mind. The doctor came again, took one look at her, and recommended immediate commitment to a Charleston asylum for the mentally afflicted. But Miss Eliza refused to leave the plantation. Some part of her broken mind understood that the curse was tied to this land, to the quarters, to Harriet. She believed, correctly or not, that leaving would give the curse freedom to follow her anywhere, that staying was the only way to maintain some control over her suffering. Her hair had turned completely white overnight, not gradually like before, but all at once, as if the terror had bleached every strand. Her face aged years in hours, becoming gaunt and haggard, her beauty destroyed by madness. She stopped eating regularly, stopped bathing, stopped caring about the refined lady she'd once been. Master Sinclair watched his wife's deterioration with growing horror and helplessness. He increased patrols around the quarters, convinced that if he could stop Harriet from working her conjure, maybe Miss Eliza would improve. But Harriet didn't need to actively work magic anymore. The curse had taken on a life of its own, feeding on Miss Eliza's guilt and fear. The plantation began falling into disorder. With the mistress mad and the master distracted, discipline slackened. Overseers drank more, worked less. Field hands found ways to slow their labor without getting caught. House slaves whispered openly about what was happening, no longer afraid of Miss Eliza's unpredictable rage. And in her madness, Miss Eliza began doing something unexpected. She started confessing. She'd grab whoever came near and pour out her sins like poison from a wound, telling them about every cruelty she'd ordered, every slave she'd had punished, every family she'd helped tear apart. "I told them to sell that woman's babies," she sobbed to Ruth one morning. 3 children, sold south to Louisiana. I heard her crying for weeks after, but I didn't care. I didn't care. And now those babies haunt me. calling for their mama, their voices in my head every night. Ruth listened in silence, offering no comfort. What comfort could there be for sins like those? By the end of that terrible week, Miss Eliza had deteriorated so completely that even the hardest-hearted overseer felt a chill looking at her. She wandered the big house at all hours, muttering to invisible companions, scratching at her skin until it bled, jumping at shadows that only she could see. And she developed one more obsession, one final terrible fixation. She had to see Harriet again, had to confront the blind woman one last time, had to beg for release from the curse or die trying. On a moonless night, when darkness covered the plantation like a shroud, Miss Eliza slipped out of the big house wearing nothing but her stained nightgown. She walked barefoot through mud and grass, guided by madness and desperation, headed straight for the quarters where Harriet waited. The final confrontation was at hand. Listen here, child. What I'm about to tell you happened in the deepest part of night, when even the moon refused to watch, when the very air seemed to hold its breath waiting for the moment when curse and cursed would finally meet face to face one last time. Miss Eliza stumbled through the quarters like a ghost haunting her own plantation, her bare feet bleeding from stones and thorns, her white nightgown filthy and torn. The slaves who saw her from their cabin windows pulled back in fear and wonder. This wraith bearing down on Harriet's cabin looked nothing like the proud mistress who'd once ruled them with cruelty and contempt. Harriet sat waiting in darkness, her blind face calm, her hands folded in her lap. She'd known this moment was coming for days, had seen it in visions clear as daylight. The final meeting, the last confrontation before everything changed forever. When Miss Eliza burst through the door, she fell to her knees immediately, crawling across the dirt floor like a penitent approaching an altar. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and terror, and something that might have been desperation or might have been the last flickering of sanity. "Please," she whispered, her voice broken and raw. "Please, I'm begging you. End it. End the curse. I can't take any more. I can't sleep, can't eat, can't think. They're always there. The voices, the faces, the chains. I feel them on me every moment, pulling me down into darkness." Harriet turned her scarred face toward the sound of Miss Eliza's voice. "You want mercy now, Sinha? After everything you done? After you took my eyes, sold my child, tried to break my spirit in every way you could imagine?" "I know," Miss Eliza sobbed, beating her fists against the floor. "I know what I did. The curse makes sure I never forget. It shows me every sin, every cruelty, plays them over and over in my mind till I want to claw my own eyes out just to stop seeing. Then you understand," Harriet said quietly. "You understand what it means to suffer, to lose everything, to have your very humanity stripped away piece by piece. That's what slavery is, Sinha. That's what you helped maintain, what you benefited from, what you defended with violence." Miss Eliza looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes wild but also somehow clearer than they'd been in weeks. "I was wrong," she whispered. "All of it. The whole system, the way we treated you, the way we justified it by saying you weren't fully human. It was all lies, evil lies we told ourselves to sleep at night, and now I can't sleep at all, because the truth won't let me rest." Harriet felt something shift in the air, felt the ancestors leaning close to listen. This confession, wrung from madness though it was, carried weight in the spirit world. Truth spoken, even by the guilty, even too late, still mattered. "You want me to lift the curse?" Harriet asked. "You want me to call off the ancestors, tell them you suffered enough?" "Yes!" Miss Eliza reached out, grabbed at Harriet's dress with trembling hands. "Yes, please, I'll do anything. I'll convince Jeremiah to free some of the slaves. I'll write to Charleston about abolition. I'll—" "Hush," Harriet interrupted, and there was steel beneath the gentleness in her voice. "You can't bargain with a curse, Sinha. You can't trade promises for peace. The ancestors don't work that way." She reached out, found Miss Eliza's face with her hands, felt the tears and the terror and the genuine remorse all mixed together. For a long moment they stayed like that, the blind slave woman and the mad mistress, two souls destroyed by the same evil system in different ways. "I can ease it some," Harriet said finally. "Can make the visions less intense, give you enough peace to sleep at night. But the curse itself? That stays. You carry it till your last breath, as testimony to what was done here, as witness to the suffering you caused. The ancestors demand that much." "Anything," Miss Eliza whispered. "Any relief, any mercy, I'll take it." Harriet began speaking then, words in the old tongue mixed with prayers in English, calling on the spirits to hear her petition. She asked them to grant Miss Eliza a measure of peace, not forgiveness, but enough easing of torment that she could function, could live with her guilt instead of being consumed by it. The air in the cabin grew thick and charged, and Miss Eliza felt something shift. The voices didn't disappear, but they quieted to whispers instead of screams. The visions remained, but became less vivid, less overwhelming. It wasn't freedom from the curse, just a loosening of the chains enough to breathe. "Thank you," Miss Eliza gasped. "Thank you, thank you." But Harriet wasn't finished. She leaned close, her blind face inches from Miss Eliza's, and spoke with a voice that carried all the weight of ancestral authority. "You listen to me now, Sinha. This mercy I'm showing you, it comes with a price. You're gonna die from this curse. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but soon. And when you do, when your last breath rattles in your chest, the ancestors will be waiting to judge you for real. How that judgment goes depends on what you do with the time you got left." "What do you mean?" Miss Eliza asked, though she already knew the answer. "You got power still," Harriet said. "Not over me, not over the spirits, but in this world. You're still the mistress of this plantation. Still got your husband's ear when you ain't lost to madness. Use that power different. Convince Sinclair to ease up on the worst cruelties. Stop families from being separated when he sells slaves. Make sure children get enough food, enough rest. It won't redeem you. Nothing can do that. But it might make your dying easier when the time comes." Miss Eliza nodded, understanding that this was both mercy and judgment, that Harriet was offering her a chance to die with slightly less blood on her hands while making clear that redemption itself was impossible. "Now go," Harriet said, releasing her. "Go back to your big house before somebody finds you here and starts asking questions that'll get both of us killed." Miss Eliza stood on shaking legs, turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Your son," she said quietly. "Samuel. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for taking him from you. If I could undo it, I would." Harriet's face showed nothing but her hands clenched tight. "Sorry don't bring him back. Sorry don't undo what's done. But maybe it's a start toward dying with a cleaner conscience." Miss Eliza walked back through the quarters, this time moving slow and deliberate, her mind clearer than it had been in weeks despite the exhaustion weighing on her. The curse still lived inside her, would kill her eventually, but at least now she could think, could function, could try to use what time remained to do something, anything, that might balance even slightly the scales of justice. Behind her, in the darkness of the cabin, Harriet sat alone and wept. Not for Miss Eliza, not for the curse or its consequences, but for her lost son, for all the children stolen and sold, for the system that kept grinding up lives and spitting out profit. And the ancestors, watching from beyond the veil, nodded their approval. Justice had been served, mercy had been granted, and the curse would continue its work until the final accounting was complete. Now you see, people, sometimes the ending of one story becomes the beginning of another. Sometimes what looks like defeat carries seeds of victory, and sometimes freedom comes not with trumpets blazing, but in the quiet darkness when chains finally crack and fall away. 3 months passed after that final confrontation. Miss Eliza kept her word as best she could. She intervened when Master Sinclair planned to sell families apart, insisted children under 10 be given lighter work, made sure the quarters got better rations during winter. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. The curse continued eating at her from the inside, though. Her body withered despite eating. Her hair stayed white as cotton. Her eyes carried the haunted look of someone who'd seen beyond the veil and couldn't forget what they'd witnessed. The slaves watched her waste away and knew. The ancestors were taking their due. slow but certain as sunrise. Then one morning in early spring, house slaves found Miss Eliza dead in her bed. She lay peaceful-like, hands folded across her chest, but her face was twisted in a final expression of terror. Whatever she'd seen at the moment of passing, it hadn't brought her comfort. The doctor declared it heart failure, but everybody in the quarters knew better. The curse had claimed her completely, just as Harriet had promised. Master Sinclair went into deep mourning, wearing black, refusing visitors, drinking heavy in his study while the plantation fell into disorder around him. Overseer Hackett had already died months before from the liver disease Harriet predicted, and with no strong hand to maintain control, the whole system began cracking at its foundations. That's when Harriet knew. The time had come. The ancestors had shown her the path north in dreams, had prepared her for this moment. Miss Eliza's death was both ending and signal, telling her that one chapter was closed and another opening. She gathered those she trusted most. Clara, young Elijah now grown into a strong man of 20, Big Samuel despite his age, and 3 others who'd proven their courage and commitment. 7 souls total, ready to risk everything for the taste of freedom. "We leave tonight," Harriet told them as they huddled in her cabin after dark. "The plantation's in chaos with Miss Eliza dead and Master Sinclair drowning in whiskey. The patty rollers ain't patrolling regular. If we're ever gonna make it, this is our moment." Clara gripped her hand tight. "What about the others? What about Aunt Dinah and the children and the old ones?" "We come back for them," Harriet promised. "Once we make it north, once we know the route and the safe houses, we come back and lead more to freedom. But first we gotta prove it can be done." They prepared through the day, gathering what little food they could hide, making bundles of extra clothes, studying the position of the North Star that would guide them. Harriet distributed mojo bags she'd prepared, each one containing protection herbs and prayers whispered over them for safe passage. As darkness fell complete, they slipped one by one from their cabins, meeting at the edge of the woods where wild places began and plantation land ended. Harriet stood at the front, blind but seeing clearer than any of them, her inner sight mapping the path ahead with guidance from the ancestors. "Follow close," she whispered. "Stay quiet as shadows. The first night's the most dangerous. If we can get 20 miles between us and this plantation before dawn, we got a fighting chance." They moved through darkness like ghosts, Harriet's feet finding safe passage over roots and stones, her ears catching every sound that might signal danger. Behind her, the others followed, their hearts pounding but their spirits soaring with the first real hope they'd known in years. The woods were thick with dangers, snakes in the underbrush, creeks to ford, brambles that tore at clothes and skin. But Harriet navigated it all, guided by senses sharper than sight, by knowledge passed down from ancestors who'd walked their own roads to freedom. Dawn found them huddled in a cave 10 miles from the plantation, exhausted but alive, listening for sounds of pursuit. They heard dogs barking in the distance. Slave catchers had been called. The hunt was on. But Harriet had prepared for this, had gathered herbs that confused the hounds' noses, had them wade through creeks that washed away their scent. "We rest here till nightfall," she said. "Then we move again. Every night we walk, every day we hide, till we cross the border into free territory." The days that followed tested them in ways they'd never imagined. Clara's feet bled from walking. Big Samuel struggled with his age and old injuries. Young Elijah nearly got caught when he went looking for food. But Harriet kept them together, kept them moving, kept them believing that freedom wasn't just a dream, but a destination they could actually reach. They followed safe houses marked with quilts hung in specific patterns, met conductors who fed them and hid them, learned songs that carried coded messages about danger and safety. The network of the Underground Railroad wrapped around them like a protective cocoon. Hundreds of brave souls, black and white, risking everything to help fugitive slaves reach freedom. 2 weeks into the journey, they had their closest call. Patty rollers cornered them in a barn just south of the Virginia border, dogs snarling, guns drawn, escape seemingly impossible. But Harriet, calm as still water, began speaking in the old tongue. calling on powers deeper than bullets or chains. Whether it was conjure or coincidence, a massive thunderstorm broke at that exact moment. Lightning striking so close it spooked the horses, rain falling so hard the men couldn't see 2 feet ahead. In the chaos and confusion, the 7 fugitives slipped away into the storm, running through mud and darkness, while their pursuers cursed and fired blindly into the night. "The ancestors are with us," Harriet said when they finally stopped to catch their breath, soaked and shaking but alive. "They didn't survive the Middle Passage just to let us die this close to freedom." And she was right. 3 days later, as dawn broke over the hills of Pennsylvania, Harriet felt something change in the air. A lightness, a lifting of weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. "We're here," she whispered, tears streaming down her scarred face. "We're in free territory. We made it." The others fell to their knees, weeping and praying and laughing all at once. Big Samuel kissed the ground. Clara held her face up to the sky. Elijah whooped with joy he couldn't contain. They were free. Actually, truly free. For the first time in their lives. But Harriet didn't celebrate long. She stood facing south, toward Georgia and the plantation she'd left behind, toward all the souls still in bondage, toward her son Samuel somewhere in the deep south suffering under chains she couldn't break. "This ain't the end," she said quietly. "This is just the beginning. I made a promise to come back, to lead more to freedom, and I aim to keep it. Rest now, brothers and sisters, but when you're ready, we got work to do. Look here, child. This is where Elder Moses brings this tale full circle, where the threads all come together, and you understand that some stories don't really end. They just keep echoing through time, teaching lessons to all who got ears to hear and hearts to understand." Years passed. Harriet became what she'd promised to be, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, returning south again and again despite the danger, leading dozens of souls to freedom. Her blindness never stopped her. If anything, it made her more effective. She navigated by the North Star she couldn't see but felt in her bones, by rivers whose rushing she could hear from miles away, by the whispers of ancestors guiding every step. The plantation in Georgia fell into ruin after Miss Eliza's death. Master Sinclair drank himself to an early grave within 2 years, and with no one to manage it, the land was sold off piece by piece. The big house where so much suffering had occurred burned to the ground one night. Some said lightning struck it. Others whispered that spirits of the enslaved finally took their revenge. Either way, it crumbled to ash and memory. But Harriet never found her son Samuel. She searched through every free state, made inquiries at every settlement, followed every rumor of a light-skinned man sold young to Louisiana plantations. The trail went cold somewhere in the Mississippi Delta, swallowed by the vastness of slavery's reach. That pain stayed with her always, a wound that never fully healed, a ghost that walked beside her even in freedom. The Civil War came eventually, just as the ancestors had shown Harriet in visions. She lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation, saw chains break legally that she'd been breaking one soul at a time for years. She worked as a nurse and a spy for the Union, using her gifts to help the cause, never forgetting where she came from or why freedom mattered. And when the war ended and slavery was abolished, Harriet, old now, her body worn from years of hard labor and harder journeys, sat on the porch of a small house in Philadelphia. Free black children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the wind like prayers answered. One of those children, a girl maybe 8 years old with curious eyes and quick questions, climbed onto Harriet's lap and touched her scarred face gently. "Grandma Harriet," she asked, "why you got no eyes? Were you born that way?" Harriet smiled, that sad, wise smile of someone who'd suffered greatly but survived. "No, baby, I had eyes once. Beautiful eyes that could see clear across the ocean to Africa where my people came from. But a cruel woman took them from me with a rusty nail, tried to break my spirit by stealing my sight." "That's terrible," the child gasped. "What did you do?" "I cursed her," Harriet said simply. "Called down the ancestors' judgment and they answered. That woman went mad from guilt and died screaming. But you know what, child? Even though I got my revenge, even though justice was served, it didn't bring back what I lost, didn't give me my eyes, didn't return my stolen son, didn't undo all the suffering that came before. The girl pondered this, her young mind wrestling with complex truths. So was the curse bad? Should you not have done it? Harriet was quiet for a long moment, her blind face turned toward the sun she couldn't see, but could feel warming her skin. The curse was necessary, she said finally. Evil has to be answered, suffering has to be witnessed, and sometimes the only justice the oppressed get is the justice they make themselves. But the real victory, baby girl, ain't in curses or revenge. It's in this. In you being free, in you never knowing chains, in you asking questions and expecting answers instead of keeping your head down and saying, "Yes, ma'am," to folks who see you as property. "Tell me the whole story," the child begged, "from the beginning." So Harriet did. She told it all. The middle passage, the auction block, the plantation, the violation, the birth of Samuel, the blinding, the curse, the madness, the escape, the long road to freedom. She told it in the old way, with the rhythm and cadence of oral tradition, making sure this child and all the others listening would remember, would pass it down to their own children and grandchildren. "And remember this always," Harriet concluded, her voice strong despite her age. "Remember that we survived. Remember that they tried to break us with whips and chains and sails and violations, but we endured. We kept our humanity when they denied we had any. We built culture and community in the shadow of bondage. We resisted in ways both large and small, from running north to working roots to singing spirituals that encoded maps to freedom." The child hugged her tight. "I'll remember, Grandma Harriet. I promise I'll remember." And she did. And she told others. And they told others still. The story spread like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever it landed, growing into a testimony that couldn't be silenced or forgotten. Harriet lived another 20 years, her body finally giving out at the age of 73. They say that on the night she died, folks gathered around her bed heard her speaking in the old African tongue she'd learned from her grandmother, calling to ancestors she'd be joining soon. Her last words, spoken in English, were simple. "Tell them I kept my promise. Tell them I led as many as I could to freedom." She was buried in a cemetery for free blacks, her grave marked with a simple stone. But her real memorial lives in the hearts of those who remember, in the stories passed down through generations, in the knowledge that one blind woman armed with nothing but ancestral power and unbreakable will changed the course of history for dozens of enslaved souls. Now you've heard this tale complete, child. You've walked with Harriet from the darkness of the slave ship to the light of freedom, from the horror of having her eyes torn out to the power of sight beyond sight. You've witnessed curse and consequence, suffering and survival, vengeance and victory. Those who endured left us their stories. Those who resisted planted seeds of freedom that still grow today. Those who suffered paved the road we walk on now with their blood and tears and unbreakable spirits. And we keep their memories alive here, in the telling and retelling, in the honoring of truths too terrible to forget and too important to keep silent. Those who suffered, suffered. Those who resisted left behind memory. And memory is what we preserve here, in the files of slavery.